Picture this. I want you to really put yourself in this scene. The dust has literally just settled in Tehran. It's late August 1953. For days, the streets have been, absolute chaos. You got orchestrated riots, tank fire, shouting crowds.
Just total bedlam.
Right, total bedlam. But now it's eerily quiet. An elected prime minister has just surrendered to military forces. And high above the clouds, a young, kind of insecure monarch, the Shah of Iran, is flying back from a brief panic exile in Rome.
Returning to a completely altered landscape.
Exactly. You are watching a country pivot on a dime. And it raises this massive lingering question for us. What actually happens on the day after you overthrow a government?
Yeah, I mean, it is the ultimate morning after scenario. You break the old system and suddenly you own the consequences.
You own all of it.
Yeah, the infrastructure and especially that massive vacuum of power that's left behind.
Welcome to this custom deep dive. Today, our mission is to explore the immediate and really the long-term aftermath of the 1953 Iranian coup. We're looking at the era spanning the 1950s straight through the 1970s.
It's a huge chunk of time.
It really is. And this entire period is defined by a very specific, honestly ruthless geopolitical transaction that we found in our sources. We're calling it the bargain in the boot.
And the central theme, the sources present here, is a stark division. It's a division between immediate tactical payoffs and these incredibly heavy long-term structural costs.
Right.
The Western powers secured unrestricted access to Iranian oil and, a reliable Cold War ally right on the Soviet Union's border.
Which was huge for them at the time.
Absolutely massive. But the cost of that transaction was the end of Iran's democratic experiments and the construction of a highly pervasive police state.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the mechanics of this specific era, we really have to look at the financial engine that drove it.
Always the money. This entire crisis didn't start over ideology. It started over oil. In 1951, Iran's parliament nationalized its oil industry. So fast forward to the days immediately following the 1953 coup, and the very first order of business is resolving that underlying dispute. Like, who gets the oil now?
And that resolution arose in 1954 via the Consortium Agreement, and it completely rewires the global energy landscape.
It's a total paradigm shift.
Yeah. Prior to the coup, the British held this ironclad monopoly over Iranian oil. Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. They pulled it out of the ground, they refined it, sold it, and kept the vast majority of profit.
While Iran got pennies on the dollar.
Exactly. But following the coup, the British are forced to share the spoils with the very people who helped orchestrate the intervention.
The Americans.
Americans, yeah. American and European oil firms are brought into the fold, and this new consortium takes control of roughly half of all Iranian oil production.
I was actually thinking about this dynamic from the sources, and the best way I can describe the 1954 Consortium Agreement to you, as a listener, is to view it as a hostile corporate takeover.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Right. Imagine the British as the original founders of this wildly profitable company, but they got kicked out by the factory workers.
The Iranian government, in this case.
Exactly. So the founders go to some powerful Wall Street investors, the Americans, and say, hey, help us orchestrate a hostile takeover to get our company back.
And the Americans provide the capital and the muscle.
The covert muscle, yeah. But when the dust clears, the Americans look at the British and say, cool, we won. Now we're taking 50% of the board seats and half your profits.
Yeah, the Americans certainly didn't engineer a regime change just to do the British a favor.
Yeah, foggy now.
They recognized the strategic and financial value of that underlying asset, and they demanded their cut.
But I want to push that corporate takeover analogy just a step further.
Right.
Because we really have to ask, what happens to the factory workers, the Iranian public, in this scenario?
Right, the people actually living there.
Yeah. The sources show that in the years following this 1954 agreement, Iran's oil revenues just start climbing steeply. We're talking about a massive influx of cash into the country.
Unprecedented amounts of money.
And logically, you might assume this sudden wealth would stabilize the nation, maybe fund infrastructure or public works to kind of pacify the population after a coup.
That would be the standard assumption.
Right. But the sources suggest this influx of cash actually altered the very fabric of the government. So how does getting extraordinarily rich change the way the Shah interacts with his own people?
What's fascinating here is the economic mechanism at play. It's something political scientists call a rentier state.
A rentier state.
Yeah. In a typical democratic or, even semi-democratic state, a government needs revenue to function, which means it has to tax its citizens.
Makes sense.
And to collect those taxes without sparking a massive revolt, the government usually has to offer something in return. Representation, a parliament, a voice in how the money is spent.
There's a transaction there.
Exactly. There is an inherent structural negotiation between the ruler and the ruled.
Because the state essentially relies on the population to keep the lights on.
Precisely. The state needs the people. But the 1954 Consortium Agreement severs that relationship entirely.
Because of the oil money.
Right. The West gets the reliable flow of oil, and the Shah receives this just staggering amount of wealth directly into the state's coffers from foreign companies.
Bypassing the public entirely.
Completely. He is suddenly financially untethered from his own population.
He doesn't need to ask the Iranian people for money anymore. Which means, I guess, he doesn't need their permission to govern.
That's exactly it. That vast wealth provided the resources to build up his military and just run the country unilaterally.
Wow.
The oil money was the functional mechanism that allowed absolute autocracy to operate without the nuisance of a democratic parliament.
The financial leverage the public might have had over the monarchy simply vanished overnight.
Poof, gone.
Which naturally brings us to the logistics of controlling a population that no longer has a voice. The boot of the regime, so to speak.
Yeah, the dark side of that wealth.
Because even with infinite oil money, you still have millions of citizens who just watch their elected government get dismantled. You have to physically enforce compliance.
You do.
And the sources show this starts right at the very top with Mohammad Mosaddegh, the prime minister who was toppled in the coup.
Yeah, his handling is, it's a masterclass in autocratic consolidation. They don't just quietly retire him, but they also carefully avoid a public execution.
Which would be too messy.
Exactly. A military tribunal convicts him of treason. He is kept in solitary confinement for 3 years and then...
3 years in solitary.
Yeah, brutal. And then he's transferred to his rural estate where he's held under strict, just unwavering house arrest until his death in 1967.
Because they recognized that executing him would instantly turn him into a martyr, like a rallying cry for the opposition.
Right, but they still had to completely erase him from the public consciousness.
They disappear him.
The goal was a slow, quiet neutralization. And with Mosaddegh neutralized, the Shah aggressively moves to consolidate absolute power.
Right.
But relying on the military to police the streets, it's expensive, it's highly visible, and it honestly often triggers more unrest.
It's a bad look.
It's a very bad look. To maintain an autocracy funded by foreign oil, you need eyes and ears everywhere. You need a robust infrastructure of surveillance.
And the sources point to a pivotal structural shift here in 1957. The Shah's government establishes SAVAK,
The secret police.
the secret police. And crucially, they didn't build it in a vacuum. The documentation confirms this security apparatus was established with the direct logistical help, training, and framework provided by the United States and Israel.
Yeah, SAVAK becomes the primary instrument of internal control for the next 2 decades. But we really need to look at how they functioned. Well, the operational strategy of a secret police force isn't necessarily about arresting every single dissenter or, staging mass public executions. It is fundamentally about engineering psychological paralysis.
Just freezing people in place.
Yeah.
But how do you logistically maintain that kind of atmospheric silence without, bankrupting the state or triggering a full-blown civil war?
You do it through unpredictable, targeted repression and the cultivation of just extreme paranoia.
Paranoia is cheap.
Exactly. SAVAK infiltrated universities, trade unions, civil service offices, media organizations.
They were everywhere.
Or at least people thought they were everywhere. The mechanism of control was the uncertainty. You never knew if your neighbor, your classmate, or your coworker was an informant.
Oh, man. So you can't even complain about the price of bread without wondering who's listening.
Right. When people start censoring themselves out of fear that a casual conversation in a cafe might lead to a midnight knock on the door, the intelligence apparatus has done its job.
The physical torture chambers certainly existed, and they were horrific. The sources are clear on that.
Absolutely.
But the threat of the torture chamber was what kept millions of people in line on a daily basis.
Yeah, it was a shadow hanging over every interaction.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, and it highlights a massive paradox in the historical narrative provided in the sources.
Oh, the public rhetoric.
Yes. If you read the public statements from Western leaders at the time, this intervention was framed entirely as a rescue mission. Like, the rhetoric claims the coup protected the quote-unquote free world from the march of communism.
That was the party line.
But when you look at the tangible policy outcomes on the ground, Protecting the free world literally meant dismantling an elected parliament, tossing a popular leader into a military prison, and actively training a secret police force to crush civilian dissent.
It's quite the contrast.
That's a huge contrast.
Yeah.
How do the sources reconcile that massive contradiction between the public rhetoric of freedom and the private engineering of a police state?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we really have to objectively analyze the Cold War calculus of the 1950s.
Right. Put ourselves in their shoes for a second.
Exactly. To the policymakers in Washington and London, the geopolitical board was entirely binary.
Us versus them.
Us versus the Soviets. The fear of a Soviet domino effect was the singular lens through which literally every global event was analyzed.
So nuance was just out the window.
Completely out the window. They genuinely believed that a fragile, somewhat chaotic democracy in a strategically vital, oil-rich nation like Iran was inherently vulnerable to Soviet subversion.
Wow, so a messy democracy was literally viewed as a security risk. The chaos of a free society was just too dangerous to tolerate right there on the Soviet border.
In the strategic logic of that era, yes, absolutely. To the foreign policy establishments of the West, installing a friendly, predictable autocrat who utilized a fearsome secret police, that was viewed as a necessary, pragmatic cost.
The lesser of two evils in their minds.
Exactly. A brutal but stable ally was deemed vastly preferable to the risk of an unpredictable democracy sliding into the Soviet sphere of influence.
Stability at all costs.
Stability was the ultimate objective. And human rights considerations, they were simply not factored into that geopolitical equation.
I'm looking at this timeline from the sources, and logically you'd think this influx of secret police activity, this absolute autocracy, would eventually cause some friction with the United States.
You would think so.
Right, like you have to wonder if anyone in Washington, as the years went by, looked at SAVAK's operations and second-guessed the arrangement. Did the U.S. ever try to reel the Shah in?
The historical record on that is remarkably consistent, and the answer is no. Instead of reeling him in, the support actually deepens over time.
And this leads us to what is arguably the most surprising realization in the sources about American politics post-1953.
The domestic side of things.
Yeah. When you look at the timeline, the initial handling of Iran was highly partisan. It was a Democratic administration under Harry Truman that favored diplomatic mediation and actively refused to overthrow Mosaddegh.
And Truman wouldn't touch it.
He wouldn't. Then, a Republican administration under Dwight Eisenhower comes into power, completely reverses course, and authorizes the covert regime change.
So the initiation of the coup was a distinctly partisan shift in strategy.
But the sources highlight an incredible pivot here. While the execution of the coup was partisan, the support for the Shah afterward became entirely, unshakably bipartisan.
It's fascinating. Once the geopolitical architecture was in place, the partisan divides in Washington regarding Iran just completely evaporated.
They vanish.
Yeah. The Eisenhower administration built the alliance. But when the Democrats took back the White House, the Kennedy administration supported the Shah.
Right.
The Johnson administration supported him. And when it flipped back to the Republicans, the Nixon administration enthusiastically expanded support for him.
So what does this all mean? How do four vastly different presidents, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, all look at this autocratic setup and agree to just keep the engine running?
It's a great question.
I mean, we are talking about leaders who navigated 2 decades of the most radical social, cultural, and political upheaval in American history. You have the post-war conservatism of the 50s, the explosion of the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, the counterculture of the 60s.
The entire country is turning upside down.
Everything in America is changing, yet the policy toward Iran remains completely frozen in amber. How does someone like JFK, who campaigned on a new, progressive vision for the world, inherit this secret police state and just hit copy-paste on Eisenhower's policy?
Well, this raises an important question about the mechanics of foreign policy momentum. When we analyze the source material, it becomes really clear that once the Shah was firmly in power and that oil consortium was functioning, a massive institutional inertia took over.
It just ran on autopilot.
Essentially, yeah. Both left-leaning and right-leaning administrations adhered to this template because, from a strictly geopolitical standpoint, it appeared to be working flawlessly.
The oil was flowing to Western markets, and the Soviets were kept out of Tehran. The primary objectives were being met.
And as impartial analysts of this history, we really have to recognize the power of the status quo in international relations. Every time a new president took office, they received intelligence briefings emphasizing the absolute necessity of a stable Persian Gulf.
Don't rock the boat.
Exactly. The prevailing wisdom across the State Department, the CIA, and the Pentagon was that disrupting the alliance with the Shah would immediately risk the global oil supply and invite a Soviet advance.
Which was political suicide.
Completely. Furthermore, there was a profound political fear in Washington, often referred to as the loss of China syndrome. No president, Republican or Democrat, was willing to be the one who, quote-unquote, lost Iran on their watch.
So the internal logic of the Cold War essentially blinded successive administrations to the reality on the ground inside Iran.
Or they chose to ignore it.
Right. The fact that the Shah's so-called stability was a highly brittle illusion maintained by SAVAK's extreme repression that was treated as an irrelevant local detail as long as the broader Cold War objectives were secure.
It was categorized as an internal Iranian matter. The bipartisan consensus was built on a very specific assumption.
Which was?
That as long as the Shah possessed absolute military power, overwhelming oil wealth, and unwavering Western backing, the societal pressures inside Iran could be contained indefinitely.
They thought it would just last forever.
The architects of this policy believed they had engineered a permanent solution.
It's an incredible look at how short-term strategic gains can completely obscure long-term structural rot.
Truly.
So to bring this all together for you listening, let's recap the core mechanisms we've uncovered from the sources today.
A bargain in the boot.
Exactly. The 1953 coup was ultimately a massive, multi-layered geopolitical trade. The West traded the existence of a young Iranian democracy for the 1954 oil consortium, guaranteeing a steady 50% cut of cheap energy.
And that oil wealth fundamentally altered the Iranian state.
It did, trading a representative parliament for an untethered monarch, consolidating absolute power for the Shah. To maintain that power without a public mandate, civic freedom was traded for the creation of SAVAK in 1957, institutionalizing a complex system of psychological fear and physical repression.
It's a heavy, heavy cost.
And, perhaps most surprisingly, this entire framework was enthusiastically endorsed and maintained by decades of bipartisan American leadership. The bargain in the boot became the unquestioned, unshakable status quo.
It was a highly calibrated system that functioned exactly as it was designed to, securing Western interests and autocratic rule for a very long time.
But I want to leave you with a final, forward-looking thought to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. We've spent this time exploring how the 1953 intervention built this seemingly flawless, bipartisan template for Cold War stability. But as we've seen, that entire template relies on one crucial unspoken rule. Every single administration has to agree to completely ignore the internal repression, the secret police, and the total lack of human rights.
Right, that's the glue holding the policy together.
So ask yourself this: what happens to that rock-solid, decades-old bipartisan alliance if, somewhere down the line, a new American president suddenly takes office and decides that human rights actually do matter in foreign policy?
That changes the entire equation.
What happens to the pillar of stability when the foundation of fear is suddenly scrutinized by its biggest backer?
It's a huge question.
Think back to that scene we started with. The dust settling in Tehran in August 1953. The streets are quiet, and the Shah is flying home to claim his absolute throne. That quiet didn't mean the conflict was resolved.
No.
It just meant the pressure was sealed underground, slowly building for decades, waiting for the exact right moment to finally explode.
The pressure cooker just waiting to go off.
Exactly. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. We will catch you next time.